Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Cogenitor, which is episode 22 of season 2 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode that won the latest poll is Cogenitor. Cogenitor is the episode where Enterprise makes first contact with an alien race that has 3 genders, the third one being a cogenitor, which only takes up 3% of the population, but is required for reproduction. Thus, they are treated like property and passed around between the men and women, and they are not treated as equals. Trip sees this as discrimination, and so begins to bond with the cogenitor and educate it, but the aliens are displeased when they learn about it and demand the cogenitor be returned to them despite it asking for asylum. Archer agrees to return the cogenitor, but then later receives a message from the aliens that the cogenitor committed suicide, and Archer dresses Trip down for interfering in cultures he knows nothing about. So this is one of my all-time favorite Enterprise episodes, as it was in my top 10 favorite episodes of Enterprise. In fact, it is my favorite episode of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, which generally speaking I don't like and think are the 2 worst seasons of any Star Trek series. In fact, this episode is the only episode from the first or second season in my top 10 favorite Enterprise episodes. Although originally Shockwave was in my top 10, but after rewatching it I realized that that 2-parter isn't as good as I remember it, so I no longer consider it in my top 10. But overall, what I'm getting at here is Cogenitor is a rare example in the first 2 seasons of actually having a good episode, and thus demonstrating what the 2 seasons of Enterprise should have been. And despite being good, this episode is in fact very typical of the first 2 seasons, as it starts off slow enough and seemingly average, with these first contact with the new alien species that we've never seen before. And this is something I heard several people mention before when complaining about storylines such as the Temporal Cold War or the Xindi story arc, is that they expected to see out of Enterprise was dozens of first contact with new species. And I actually never really understood that desire myself, as that sounds really boring. It sounds like what we got in the first 2 seasons, and it was dull, cliche, and unoriginal, and uninteresting, and boring, and whatever. However, watching this episode, I now get it, because this is a great story about first contact with an unfamiliar culture, although I do still believe that if this was done a lot, that even this would get tedious. However, this episode plays off the fact that Starfleet is new to the galaxy and not really familiar with dealing with alien culture in the best ways. And in the past, I've made no secret that Trip, Charles Tucker III, is one of my least favorite characters in all of Star Trek, but I actually liked him in this episode because it takes the fact that he's a bumbling idiot and makes a good story out of it. But to be fair, you can buy Trip's behavior here and in fact get behind him, because he has nothing but good intentions, and you can see where he's coming from because he's not entirely wrong. Although I would say that it seems like, the first ever human ship should have diplomats or sociologists on board who would be more suited to dealing with meeting strange new aliens for the first time, rather than leaving the task to engineers who are in no way, shape, or form educated to deal with meeting new alien cultures. But whatever, I suppose Star Trek has always been this way, although Next Generation did have Counselor Troy, and even Picard himself was a trained diplomat, whereas no one on board Enterprise seems qualified to deal with situations like these. But I digress. So in addition to the storyline with the cogenitor, we also get several side plots, such as the one where Archer goes on an adventure with the alien captain into the star to study it. The captain is played by the now late Andreas Katsulas. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but he's best known from Babylon 5, and is better known to Star Trek fans as playing Commander Tom Locke on several episodes of The Next Generation. Anyway, he and Archer bond as they get out of some hairy situations, and this storyline was mostly dull and uninteresting. However, It did serve the overall purpose of showing what a close bond Archer was building with these aliens, and in fact, it was essential to the end of the story. So I wouldn't say these scenes were unnecessary. They weren't all that interesting to watch, but they did serve a purpose that added a lot to the ending of the episode. The other side plot I found a bit less necessary, and that involved Reid flirting with the tactical officer of the alien ship. Now, I appreciated this storyline because in the past, Reid was portrayed as someone who always tries to get lucky but fails and is rather dorky, so I found it rather refreshing that the hot chick he was flirting with was actually interested in him as well. And their relationship made sense because they were both tactical officers on their relative ships, and she was obviously very curious about learning more about new cultures, and for the most part I found the way the storyline played out was quite believable. However, it didn't seem all that necessary for the overall plot and seemed to just be thrown in there to fill up the runtime of the episode, otherwise known as filler. However, I could see that it helped flesh out the culture more and the situation of the Enterprise trying to learn more about new alien species, but ultimately this entire subplot could have been cut without affecting the story of the episode whatsoever. However, one nitpick I have about this storyline is how come Reid gets to have sex with an unknown alien they know nothing about without consulting Phlox, even if it was afterwards. It seems like a really risky thing to do. You know that episode when Trip got pregnant and they all assumed that he had sexual relations with some unknown alien? Everyone was jumping down his throat and being, "Oh, how could you idiot, blah, blah, blah." Yet Reid is free to bang alien chicks with no repercussion whatsoever, even if it's just a doctor's visit. But, I think that's a little far-fetched. And speaking of Dr. Phlox, I'm reminded of how much I like him and how I think he's the best character on Enterprise, particularly in the first 2 seasons. He was one of the rare bright spots. This episode again portrays his sexual inhibitions as he finds it fascinating but not unusual that these aliens have 3 sexes, and when asked about specifics on how their sexual interactions work, he gleefully states that he has pictures. Many may see this as Phlox being a creepoid, but really comes down to the fact that Genobulans simply have different attitudes when it comes to sex and don't share humans' tendency to be prudish on the subject. And I just love the way this naturally works in this episode. But now, finally, let me get to the heart of the episode, the moral dilemma presented. Now, I always consider this one of the better episodes of Enterprise, but I never heard it referred to that fondly, generally speaking. It's typically rated rather moderately, particularly on IMDb. It has sort of an average rating. So this led me to believe that this episode was underrated, which another commenter expressed the same opinion on one of my videos. However, when I researched fan reviews and the overall fan reaction to this episode, I discovered that this episode isn't underrated as such, and it's more that it's polarizing. As apparently there's a lot of people who love this episode, but also a sizable amount of people who hate this episode, and this all comes down to the theme, so let's get into this. So, Star Trek is well known for its social messages. In fact, something I love about Star Trek, which is why this episode really appeals to me. However, most of its messages are usually something along the lines of racism is bad, bigotry towards homosexuals is bad, war is bad, genocide is bad, stuff like that. Powerful messages that need to be said, and Star Trek usually does a great job of doing it, but for the most part, these are pretty universally agreed upon. And I know there's still issues with war, racism, and bigotry, even by today's standards, let alone in the 60s and the early 90s. But for the most part, these are issues the majority of thinking people who watch Star Trek can agree upon. This episode, however, touches on issues that are actually very decisive and controversial, even within the liberal community itself. And that's something Star Trek rarely does. And I'm referring to the issue of cultural diversity and sensitivity. The message here is pretty clear, as it's about Commander Tucker interfering with another alien culture in order to stick up for someone he believes is being discriminated against, and then he is chastised for doing so, and the result ends up being the person in question committing suicide, which Captain Archer said point blank is Trip's fault, and that he is responsible for her death by interfering in the culture that he knows nothing about. Now, as I said, this created a backlash because the analogy here seems to be of Mideastern cultures who are very different than Western cultures, in particular in regards to women's rights, which are viewed very differently. So, some reviewers some reviews that I read that hated this episode claim this episode is saying that it's okay for these cultures to discriminate against women because it's part of their culture. As generally speaking, this is the counter argument whenever the claim is made that we need to understand and respect different cultures, which is clearly the message behind this episode, so it makes kind of sense that those who disagree with that message would be morally opposed to this episode. However, I don't want to be harsh as to say such viewers misinterpret this episode, so instead I'll say my interpretation or my read on this episode was quite different. I don't see it as saying that it's okay for other cultures to discriminate against women because it's part of their culture. I see it more as saying when dealing with issues like discrimination in other cultures, it makes sense to first understand that culture and deal with that issue within the confines of that culture. And I'd say there are several clues to this in the episode. And rather than the episode saying that Trip was wrong, it's more of saying the way that he went about trying to do something about it was wrong. So, let me give a real-life example of this. I recently read an article about a prominent lawyer in Egypt going on, national television in Egypt and saying that women should not wear ripped jeans in public. In fact, he went as far to say that if a woman does wear ripped jeans that show her behind in public, it is a man's patriotic duty to sexually harass her, and a man's national duty to rape her. Now, I'm not saying this is how everyone, or even the majority of people in Egypt think. However, it is an indicator of how different that culture is over there and how more prevalent such vile thoughts that no one in the Western culture could get away with stating in public are. In fact, Cairo was rated as the most dangerous megacity for women in the world, and another study showed that 99.3% of Egyptian women have been victims of sexual harassment. So, taking that into account, it does appear these are the kinds of sentiments that are common in that culture. Now, I don't care what the cultural perspective is. Calling it a national duty to rape women because of the clothing they wear is one of the most vile, disgusting, and disturbing statements that I've ever heard. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say has to put such statements in line with statements from Hitler or Goebbels about how Jews are like rats and need to be exterminated. So I don't give a crap what the hell the cultural context is. That statement is disgusting and something that clearly needs to be done about this attitude. And if someone tried to dismiss such a statement by saying, oh, you don't understand, that's just their culture, then they'd be dead wrong. There are no ways around it, no ifs, ands, or buts. They're wrong. So I can kind of understand where people are coming from if they believe this episode is, for example, trying to excuse sentiments like that under the banner of cultural sensitivity. However, I don't think that is what this episode is doing. So now let me give another real-life example on the other extreme. Generally speaking, nowadays the Iraq War is looked on as a disaster and a situation where there are no real winners. Back in the early 2000s when the episode aired, the overall general sentiment, at least in the United States, was in support of it. In fact, many who were opposed to it were actively mocked and singled out as unpatriotic on national television. I remember reading a science fiction short story written back in 2003 that took place 20-odd so years in the future, and this short story referred to Iraq as having a democratic paradise, thanks to American intervention, and even described there being a Disneyland being built in Iraq. I had never heard something so ignorant, so unintelligent, and just so shockingly obtuse. However, it was unfortunately a sign of how ignorant the vast majority of Americans who supported the war were, as they were just sold a bill of lies, and it wasn't until later in that decade that they started to realize that. But still, to think there'd be a Disneyland built in Iraq in 20 years, thanks to Americans coming to save the day, expressed an extreme amount of ignorance, not only of the culture in Iraq, but the political situation there and all the complexities involved. So in other words, in this episode, Trip was an analogy for the ignorant American who thought there would be a Disneyland in Iraq. Now, this isn't to say Trip was wrong about the Cogenitor being discriminated against, just like people aren't wrong about Egypt having a serious issue with women's rights. But it's saying that the situation with other cultures are more complex than just the white hero coming in to save the day and make things better for the backward primitives. And that's the kind of attitude that Trip had. He saw something wrong, so he rushed in to correct it, but with no regard or thought given to how this alien culture would react to his interference. So the reason why I say this episode isn't simply saying it's okay to discriminate because of culture is because the episode goes out of its way to point out through that the brain scans of the Cogenitor, they're just as capable of intelligence as the male and females of its species. It would be a very different case if it was revealed that the Cogenitor was a less evolved species and therefore its treatment is actually appropriate for its intelligence level. That would be more along the lines of like in the pilot episode of Enterprise where they went to an alien world and Trip interceded because he thought a woman was abusing her child when really she was just preparing the child to breathe easier as dictated by their alien's physiology. In that case, Trip was just ignorant of that alien and mistook a normal part of their biology for abuse when it wasn't. But in that case, that isn't the case here, and the episode makes a point of making that clear that the way the Cogenitor is being treated is, in fact, discrimination. Also, the episode does an amazing job at showing the wonder of the Cogenitor beginning to learn and her yearning and desire to read and watch movies and just learn more about the world and experience things that she never thought that she could experience, and how for the first time in her life she was being treated as an equal and sees that there could be more to life than she ever thought. And the fact this was something that she really wanted, and it really got the audience to sympathize and relate to the Cogenitor. So clearly the episode was demonstrating that denying the Cogenitor basic rights was wrong. However, the ending made it clear that Trip just swooping in to be the savior was not at all the appropriate way to deal with the issue, and he was in fact coming from a place of ignorance even if his intentions were good. I did like how in the final scene where Archer tells Trip the Cogenitor committed suicide, Trip says, "Oh, it's my fault." Now, typically whenever a character like that blames themselves for someone else's death, whether or not they actually are to blame for the death, the other character involved will always try to console them and say, "No, it's not your fault. Oh, don't beat yourself up." So I loved Archer's response when he said, "You're damn right." That was so unexpected. But if you notice, Archer didn't punish or reprimand Trip because he knew that knowing the consequences of what he's done would be punishment enough. Now, there are some who rather than blame Trip for the Cogenitor's death, they blame Archer. And in fact, they totally take Trip's side. They blame Archer for returning the Cogenitor to the alien ship instead of keeping her aboard Enterprise. Now, first, let me touch on an issue. Another thing I love about this episode is the fact that it is the first human ship to explore space and takes place before the Federation was established, was really present in this episode, and particularly when the Cogenitor asked for asylum. This is very different than had this occurred in, say, Next Generation times. Because in Next Generation times, as soon as someone asks for asylum, the matter is then transferred to Federation diplomats and officials who then deal with this issue as they are trained to do so. However, in this case, no such system yet exists for such situations, and therefore Archer is all alone, has no system to turn to. Thus, it kind of makes sense that non-interference would take precedent because a system to grant her asylum does not exist yet. Now, on the other hand, let's assume that Archer did grant her asylum, which, by the way, he was very close to doing, as the decision for him to turn the Cogenitor over to her people was not an easy one, and one that he did, in fact, agonize over. But let's assume for the moment that he didn't turn her over to them. What would be the result? For one, he would have soured the relationship between these aliens, and they would be at odds with each other, possibly even leading to future conflicts in which lives could be lost. Although that's only a slight possibility, it's still a possibility. At the very least, the chances of them having cordial diplomatic relations in the future would be all but gone. And the Cogenitor would be able to live in equality, but also in isolation, never having any further contact with her people, and the couple wanting to reproduce wouldn't be able to do so. And by the way, this would change absolutely nothing about how this culture functions, nor the way of life for the Cogenitors. This would be completely unaffected on the quality of life for the other Cogenitors, would remain exactly the same. However, many may argue that it's still a better solution because she wouldn't be discriminated against and she'd still be alive, so it'd be worth it. Maybe, I don't know, that's debatable. I would debate against that. However, seeing how this would lead to further conflict with these aliens, which could have unforeseeable consequences. But again, does that mean Trip was wrong to be concerned for the Cogenitor? No. In fact, if he did nothing and instead brought his concerns to the captain, in the future they could use their treatment of the Cogenitor as talking points in further negotiations, and over time could in fact influence their culture as a friendly voice of an ally. Whereas if they were a voice of an enemy that shows no respect for the culture, then they'll simply be ignored and dismissed as an ignorant force trying to interfere in matters they know nothing about. And that could affect an entire culture rather than just one person. Sure, it would be a much longer process, but that's the whole point. Cultural issues like this take time. And plus, this isn't simply a clear case of discrimination and is far more complicated than that, as this culture has evolved over centuries through necessity to treat their Cogenitors as precious commodities, as they only make up 3% of their population, and to simply let them abandon any reproduction duties to go off and climb mountains or watch movies would have devastating side effects for the entire culture. Now, this isn't to say they shouldn't be shown more respect and treated more like equals, as clearly they should. But it is to say that this issue is far more complicated than having an alien savior come in and save the day by judging an alien culture by his own cultural standards, which are entirely different from theirs, as they evolved entirely differently. They're set in entirely different rules that he knows absolutely nothing about. And I do think that is the message of this episode. Not that it's okay to discriminate because of culture, but that there will be no Disneyland in Iraq, and it rejects the notion of the white savior as a cultural differences are far more complex and complicated and need to be treated that way. And I think this episode does that extremely well in a very powerful way, full of great writing and excellent performances. So my rating for Cogenitor out of 10 is a 10, the best. One of the best episodes of Enterprise, and by far the best episode of its first 2 seasons. Although it did have a side plot that wasn't particularly interesting and another one that wasn't particularly necessary, it overall did an amazing job of painting the picture of a first contact with a strange but friendly alien culture and exploring the issues involving and directly interfering with a culture you know nothing about, but imposing your own cultural standards to that alien culture. Even though Trip wasn't wrong and his heart was in the right place, his actions actions were foolhardy and ignorant of how complex the situation actually was, and thus had dire consequences that he'll have to live with. This was a very powerfully explored and a beautifully constructed story that is an accomplishment. So that's it for my review of Cogenitor. It is now time for me to select the options for the next poll, which you can vote on to select which episode I will review next. This review will come in approximately a week, so let's randomly choose 5 options. So let's select our options for the next Star Trek episode I will review. We'll choose one from each of the series using the handy dandy random episode generator website. Let's start with the Star Trek original series, and the selection for this episode is The Enterprise Incident, Season 3, Episode 2. An apparently insane Captain Kirk has the Enterprise deliberately enter the Romulan neutral zone, where the ship is immediately captured by the enemy. Pretty classic episode, pretty decent episode. Not one of my favorites, but definitely a good one. So that's your original series option. We'll look for Next Generation. Next Generation option is The Dolphin, Season 2, Episode 10. Ensign Wesley Crusher suffers from the pangs of first love when the Enterprise is tasked to transport a young woman, Slayer, back to her home to when she's become a leader of her people. I'm not going to read all that, that's too much. But you know, it's the episode where she ends up being a shapeshifter and the special effects are very, very bad. Not a horrible episode, maybe. I think some people think it's horrible. I don't think it's horrible, but it's not particularly good either. I don't know, it's kind of typical of the second season. Anyway, let's see what our Deep Space Nine option is, and that is The Reckoning. Oh, that's a pretty decent episode. Spiritualists on Bajor summon Captain Sisko to the planet's surface, where they show him a stone tablet with some unknown inscriptions. Once on Deep Space Nine, the inscriptions reveal an ancient prophecy of coming disasters surrounding the wormhole. Bajor and Deep Space Nine, as those around him voiced their uneasiness about Sisko being the emissary for the planet. I actually kind of like this episode. It's kind of a bit sort of hokey, fantasy-like, but I think it's actually good. There's things to like about it. I wouldn't mind talking about that one if you choose that. So next we'll go to the Voyager option, which is Twisted. So, Voyager encounters a non-corporeal, sentient, space-dwelling life form, which is interested in communicating with, learning more about the ship, the people. Too bad it couldn't just say that as being passes through the ship. It upsets computer-controlled communications and, more bizarrely, distorts the physical arrangement of decks and sections. I talked about this a bit about my Season 2 Voyager review, and those who've seen that video and seen me talk about this episode probably know why I'm laughing. I'll probably get into more about this episode and my personal experience with it, but it's not a good episode. Like, I'll just sum up by saying, like, the only enjoyment I got out of watching this episode was watching it with my friends and making fun of it. Really not particularly good. Okay, so now we have to do Enterprise, which we do a funky way. Let's go to the random. So which season? We're going with Season 2. Oh, always Season 2 of Enterprise. Jesus Christ. Does this thing have any other settings other than Season 2? Alright, let's go for number one. Number one. Which is... number one is Shockwave, which I've already done, I believe. Yeah, so I'll have to choose again. I'll start from the season. Go in it again because I already reviewed Shockwave. Okay, generate something else. We got Season 4, finally. Jeez. Okay, let's see. So Season 4 had, I believe, 22 episodes. So let's go Season 4, Episode 5. Okie dokie. Is that the Augments? Season 4, Episode 5 is, Cold Station 12. So that's basically the Augments trilogy. I would review all 3 episodes. I'm not just going to review the one episode, Cold Station 12. So I'll call that the Augments trilogy, which is fairly decent. Maybe not one of the best of Season 4. Like, I think the Vulcan trilogy was better, but it was still good, still decent. Good cameo from Brent Spiner. Okay. So yeah, so those are your 4 options. You got with the original series, you have the Enterprise incident. With Next Generation, you have the Dolphin, Deep Space Nine, you have the Reckoning, pretty interesting, and Voyager, you have Twisted, and Enterprise, the Augments trilogy. So those are your options. Be sure to vote in the poll, which should end up right here in this little corner here. There should be a little eye icon pop up right over there. Just click on that, vote for which episode you want me to review, and I will do so in a week. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos, as well as many other videos and shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.